Welcome, everyone, to this extraordinary STAR panel on the 2020 elections. My name is Bernard Harcourt, and I'm a professor of law and political science here at Columbia University and the executive director of the Eric H. Holder Jr. Initiative on Civil and Political Rights at Columbia College. Our mission here is to bridge theory and practice, to bridge the ancients and the moderns, to bridge the Columbia core and contemporary political circumstances. We focus on what Eric Holder describes as the duties, the rights, and the weighty responsibilities of American citizenship. The Holder Initiative is here to foster scholarly inquiry, policy discussions, and public engagement that draws on the principles of the Columbia core. Tonight's event is part of the American Voter Project. It's a series of conversations on the challenges to the electoral system in this country. We've explored everything from the Electoral College to gerrymandering to Supreme Court nominations. This panel today is going to focus on the upcoming presidential election, and it's the 12th installment, actually, of our American Voter Project series. We are going to be open to questions after the panel discussion, so please use the question and answer function for that purpose. Now, let me first introduce our extraordinary panel this evening. We are joined by Eric H. Holder Jr., the 82nd Attorney General of the United States, who served from February 2009 to April 2015. He was the third longest serving Attorney General in the history of the United States. In addition, with his time as Attorney General, he served in the government for more than 30 years under the administrations of President Obama, of course, but also President Clinton and President Reagan. And most important for us, welcome home, Eric Holder, class of 73 at Columbia College and class of 76 at Columbia Law School. It's great to have you back. It's great to be in discussion. I can't believe it's our 12th panel on this.
Time flies.
Yeah, it does. We are also joined and delighted to be joined by Vanita Gupta, who is president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Vanita Gupta served as acting assistant attorney general and head of the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division from October 15, 2014 to January 2017. So essentially, she was the chief civil rights prosecutor for the United States. She led the investigations into Ferguson, Baltimore, and Chicago police departments. She headed the appeals of the Texas and North Carolina voter ID cases. Also the challenge to North Carolina's HB 2 law and other transgender rights litigation. Prior to that, Ms. Gupta served as deputy legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union, and before that as an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. So we're thrilled to have you with us, Vanita. Thank you.
Here.
We are also joined and delighted to have with us Eugene Robinson, who is a columnist and associate editor at the Washington Post, where he writes a twice-a-week column on politics and culture. Mr. Robinson has had a 3-decade career at the Washington Post, where he's been City Hall reporter, city editor, foreign correspondent in Buenos Aires and London, foreign editor, assistant managing editor in charge of the paper style section. He is a recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2009 for his columns on the 2008 presidential elections. And he's also the author of several books, including Disintegration, The Splintering of Black America in 2010, Last Dance in Havana in 2004, and Coal to Cream, A Black Man's Journey Beyond Color to an Affirmation of Race in 1999. So thank you, Eugene, for joining us this evening.
Good to be here.
And we are also joined by Nate Silver. Welcome back, Nate. We've been fortunate enough to have you at several stages of the previous elections, and so we're thrilled to have you here tonight. Many of you know Nate. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of FiveThirtyEight. He's the leading statistician in the country, I would say, political statistician, a best-selling author, known for his unique brand of creativity and journalism and statistical analysis. He's the founder of the 538 website, which is an award-winning website and which is now acquired by ABC News in 2018. His most recent book, The Signal and the Noise, Why So Many Predictions Fail, But Some Don't, is a New York Times bestseller. And again, it's really great to have you back on the panel, Nate. Thanks so much for joining us. Now, let's get into the conversation. We're all anxious to hear what you all think. Obviously, the political situation kind of changes day by day. Even as I was sitting in the green room, I checked the New York Times and the Washington Post to see, you know, if anything had happened in the last 3 minutes. It's that kind of a political context we live in, and who knows what we will be facing by November the 3rd. So much of what we are speculating about might change dramatically. But there's a lot to think about right now, and so what I'd like to focus on here are kind of what's being done in preparation for the election, what's being thought of in terms of what's being prepared for after the election as well. I thought we could start with you, General Holder, and to get a sense of what you're working on most intensively right now in the run-up to the elections to ensure a fair election on November 3rd, 2020, and what you're working on and what your thoughts are about the election that's coming up.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back. Good to see you, Bernard, and I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. You know, there are a variety of things that I'm thinking about and working on, and you know, with Vanita as well. You know, I'm concerned about basic kinds of things. The number of polling places. You know, since the Shelby County decision in 2013, about 1,700 polling places have closed, as you might expect. Disproportionate number of those places that were closed are in neighborhoods of communities of color, or places where Democrats are perceived to reside. So there's that. The unnecessary use of photo ID, which is, you know, nothing new. And this is something that we've had to worry about over, you know, the course of years, but still is a concern. The effectiveness of the Postal Service with regard to the delivery of votes that are cast by mail. Then all things that keep popping up. I mean, in Ohio and in Texas now, they want to limit the number of places where people can fill out a ballot and then just drop it off. In Harris County, there'll only be one. But the governor's rules, you can only have one per county. Harris County, as I understand it, is larger than the state of Rhode Island. I think it has about 4 million people in it. So there's going to be one place where you can drop off a ballot. There's a whole range of things. I mean, with regard to the submission of votes by mail, you know, signature matching requirements. You know, there's a whole range of things that are being put in the front of people who simply want to use that which is their most sacred right as Americans, and that is their ability to cast a ballot. And, you know, one party has made a determination that they are going to try to manage that and try to pick the people who should be allowed to vote, while the other party, and I'm the other party, and so I'm not totally objective here, while the other party is trying to make it as easy as possible for as many people to vote as is possible. So there are a whole range of things, you know, that we are focused on. I'm the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and so we are working within the organization to focus on these issues, but we're also reaching out to you know, other organizations, working with Stacey Abrams, for instance, and her organization to, again, try to make sure that we have just a fair vote, just a fair vote. Because I'm actually pretty confident that if the vote is fair, Democrats and progressives will do, you know, will do just fine. This is a critical election, given the fact that we have a presidential election that is of, I think, existential importance, but it's also important because we will be picking a substantial number of the people who will serve in state legislatures next year and who will be drawing the lines in redistricting, and that will have an impact on really the political fate of the nation over the course of the next decade. So it's one of those elections where you have a presidential election plus the election the year before before redistricting. And so for any number of reasons, this is a critical election, and one of the reasons why we are focusing so much of our attention on trying to make it as fair and as inclusive as we can.
Thank you. Thank you, General Holder. So let me go to you, Vanita Gupta, please, to bridge kind of the present and the future in a way, to talk about what you're doing right now as part of the leadership conference, and then also for us to think for a minute about what is being prepared in anticipation of possibly some lawsuits after November 3rd.
Maybe just a sprinkling or a few. So thank you. I mean, a lot of what General Holder is talking about right now are efforts, advocacy, litigation that's happening really intensively. There are, I don't know what the total tally is right now, maybe General Holder does, but it is several hundred lawsuits that have been filed since COVID, certainly by civil rights organizations, by the parties, mainly the Democratic Party and civil rights organizations seeking to open up voter options and access given the unprecedented conditions of holding a general election amid a pandemic, and another party, the Republican Party, fighting to close off the options and access. And a lot of this is really an effort to actually avert the legions of lawsuits that people are very worried about after November 3rd. So they are the types of things that General Holder is talking about, and also trying to make sure there are pushes in states to have states be able to count ballots even before November 3rd, so to ease the pressure and allow for the American public to have results sooner. States like Florida are likely to be able to count and have the results much, much sooner because they are able to start counting ballots a few weeks before November 3rd, whereas other states like Wisconsin have closed off that option. And it just places a lot more pressure on local and state election officials, already under a lot of pressure, actually under increasing threats, which we should talk about too in terms of intimidation, to be able to return ballots. We have been preparing the media and the American public to be patient, to be prepared that if democracy is actually working on November 3rd, in many parts of the country, we are not going to have results. And that is a very uncomfortable thing for the kind of Twitter breaking news, public that we have become. And that we need to make sure that every ballot is counted. But we are also guarding against the premature calling of results. And so all of the agita that has been created by President Trump's comments about being unwilling to accept the results and potentially prematurely calling results. And I wouldn't just say this is at the foot of the president. There may be other candidates around the country who are going to overinflate exit polls out of in-person voting and try to claim victory while, hundreds of thousands of absentee ballots may not be counted. A lot of the groundwork and the comments that are being made right now to attack legitimate forms, safe forms, secure forms of voting, like mail-in voting, are, I think, efforts to delegitimize the election and to call into question the legality or veracity of absentee ballots after November 3rd. And so these are some of the scenarios that we are very concerned about. There is a concern, and I think, I always say voter suppression is not just about the barriers, affirmative barriers that officials may be putting in place for voters, but actually the demoralization and the disaffection in our democracy that can end up making voters feel like the system is so rigged, why bother participating? And so in this moment, while we are talking about and trying to prepare against concerns around voter intimidation at the polls, concerns around, proper ballot counting and making sure every vote is actually counted, we also need to make sure that voters have maximum confidence that they actually have the power to determine the outcome of this election, and that the best inoculation against all of these threats really is high voter turnout. But there are a lot of threats that we are kind of prepared for in this unprecedented election. I've just named a few. There's a rabbit hole that I could go down. But I think the most important thing right now is that voters understand that having a plan to vote and voting as early as possible and voting in the highest turnout levels that we have ever seen, which right now we've got, I think as of yesterday night, Nate may be able to tell me better, but 4 million Americans have now already voted per at least one site that is collecting data from states that actually report into it. That is 50 times more than at the same level at the same time in 2016. So, you know, we have to prepare for all of these things, but we need to make sure voters have confidence in our system too.
Thank you, Vanita Gupta. So that was the perfect segue to Nate Silver, actually, to tell us a little bit about the early voting and the difference in terms of the turnout with 4 years ago, but also to give us kind of some sense of the forecast for these elections in terms of likely returns, and also how this election is going to differ from 2016 in terms of the forecasting itself, in terms of how you are forecasting it.
Yeah, so in some ways, I worry about all the same things that people on this panel are worried about, some of which are inside the scope of the forecast, but a lot of which aren't. So let's suspend disbelief though and pretend for a while that everything is normal. From like a polling standpoint, this is not a very close election right now. Trump has fallen behind by almost 10 points, international polling average. Biden's expanded his lead since the first debate, whether it's because of the debate or because of the president's COVID diagnosis, I'm not quite sure. But it's gone from 7 to 10. And 10 points is a pretty gargantuan margin. That's Reagan over Carter in 1980 roughly, or Bush over Dukakis. You know, it could be the largest defeat of an incumbent since Herbert Hoover in 1932. Now, a couple of things. One, there is still 4 weeks roughly left of time for things to change. Although the election has started now, people are voting in many states. But given all the crazy news events, most of which haven't moved the polls that much, but maybe something works in Trump's favor. You know, also the Electoral College is a bit more competitive. So what we call the tipping point states, which are the states that if you have a close election, might be vote number 270 out of 538. Pennsylvania, for example, Biden is more like 6 or 7 points ahead. Wisconsin, Michigan, 6 or 7 points ahead, which is a solid lead, but not as big a lead as 10 points. So that's the real margin in the race, probably 7 points right now. So how robust is that? Again, that's kind of the question our model tries to answer. And it says there's a 15% chance that Trump will win despite all this, which is not low. 15% is 1 in 6. That's roughly speaking Russian roulette. So, you know, we'd rather be in Biden's position, but you know, 15% is not trivial. We spend a lot of time trying to educate people that, hey, if you're age 70 or older, if you catch COVID, you have a 5% chance of dying. Most people understand that a 5% chance of dying plus an additional substantial risk of long-term illness is something which you would take very seriously, take a lot of precautions against. You know, at the same time, it's a little bit hard to see what Trump could do to come back. Coronavirus is an issue on which the American public thinks he's done a very poor job. It's going to be the focus, you would think, of the last 27 days, given the Trump's diagnosis, plus the numbers rising again in some parts of the country, plus this outbreak associated with the White House itself. That's not the closing issue that Trump would prefer. Also, he's played a lot of his cards. He's tried to play the law and order card. He's tried to, you know, his convention didn't really move the numbers. There's only going to be one more debate, it seems, or that could change. So he doesn't have the mechanisms to necessarily get back in the race by the means that a candidate usually would. With that said, let's think about some of the things that maybe are unusual about this election. One of them has to do with the counting of votes, as well as the shift to mail voting. There are different theories about the effect that mail voting could have, and the premise here is that Democrats are now much more likely to vote by mail than Republicans are. Because Trump has talked it down, although he's also talked it up at times, but he has sent very mixed messages where Democratic groups have largely said, hey, vote early as soon as you can. If you fill out your ballot right, then vote by mail. So you see mail votes much more likely to be Democratic. You have data in from a lot of states that show votes by party ID, and there's a big Democratic split. So is that good news or bad news for Democrats? And there's a case either way. It can be good news because generally speaking, when states switch over to mail voting as an option, or even mandatory mail voting, turnout goes up. It's just easier to send in a vote by mail. There's not the chance that you're going to have a tire blowout in your car on election day, or you get detained late at work, or there's a COVID outbreak in your neighborhood, so you want to avoid the polling place, right? Generally speaking, voting rights groups, people will correct me if I'm wrong, say we would prefer mail voting as an option. It kind of locks in turnout. The flip side is that what if ballots are lost in the mail? What if ballots are rejected because you don't put the ballot in the right envelope, or because the signature doesn't match, you don't have the witness signature where you need it in many states, or it arrives too late? The ballot spoilage rate is estimated variously at anywhere between 1% and 4%. So if you have more Democratic ballots being spoiled, then that could cause a problem. Our model tries to account for some of this. We assume that polling error might be larger because of the switch to mail voting. In the primaries after the pandemic hit, you had actually generally very high turnout, considering the primaries weren't competitive at that point, but also very unpredictable and erratic from state to state, depending on their rules. But there are also things that we don't try to account for. We don't account for a rearguard action where, you know, Trump would try to persuade some state legislatures to appoint a different set of electors, right? That's outside the scope of our model. We assume that there's always, I hate this kind of both sides framing, right? But like, look, there's always been voter suppression. There's always been a battle between the parties where Democrats want to have as many people vote as they can. Republicans want to suppress the vote. I mean, and that, you know, we actually look for changes in state laws. So for example, in Michigan, you have a Democratic governor now. You've had expansion of the right to vote. In Texas, you have you don't have no excuse absentee voting. So we actually account for that a bit in our model. But still, if there were massive attempts to take huge numbers of ballots that had been cast legally in a reasonable person's eye and throw those out somehow, then that kind of is outside the scope of our model. And we try to provide a benchmark for what would happen if you have only the normal degree of voter suppression and not something extraordinary involving the courts. So yeah, like I said, like the polls can be wrong, but at this point, even if the polls were as wrong as they were in 2016, Biden would still win fairly comfortably. So what you probably need to have happen is for the election to tighten, so we're back to like a 6 or 7 point race, and then the polls might be a little bit wrong, and then Trump wins the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. That is possible, although every day that ticks off on the clock without Trump gaining ground, and currently he's been losing ground, makes that a little bit harder.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks for that diagnosis. I'm going to come back to some of that in a minute, but first I'd like to hear from Eugene Robinson. And I'd like you to give us a little bit of, I'd like you to give us kind of like the Pulitzer Prize view of the situation.
Oh, great.
I mean, the overall kind of, you know, zeitgeist of this season, this electoral season, and describe in a way kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. And is this really a kind of a world historical situation? Is politics really changing in the United States, and it's going to have a long-lasting effect, or is it really, is this a blip in the road in a way? Go ahead.
Ooh. Well, if it's a blip, it's a really big blip. I mean, I think, you know, things have been insane. We've never seen politics like this in this country. I don't think, certainly not in my career, not in my lifetime, have we seen a presidency like this, a president like this, a candidate who, like Donald Trump, either in 2016 but especially now, we've never seen anything quite like this. And you know, I hate to break this to everybody, but I think things are going to get a little crazy between now and the election. I mean, I think a little crazier. If you think back, you know, 1 week ago, right? Just 1 week ago, we'd had the first debate, which was, again, like no other debate. The reaction to that was not good for the president. You saw his the instant sort of polls. You saw his numbers weren't looking very good, and then all hell broke loose, and we learned that one of his close aides had COVID, and then we learned that he had COVID, and then he was helicoptered to Walter Reed, and then every day there's been just something jaw-dropping that has happened, and the president's anxiety level over the election. I mean, he knows what the numbers are saying, and I don't know if he's been able to convince himself that the polls are wrong. That's what he keeps telling his supporters, and that's what he said on his Fox Business Network interview this morning, in which he said a whole bunch of crazy stuff. But he said the polls are wrong. He doesn't believe the polls. Look at all the boat parades that they have for him. So how could the boat people not be right? So maybe he's convinced himself that everything's going to be fine, but I doubt it. I think he understands the numbers, and I think he understands that if something doesn't change, he's going down to perhaps a historic defeat, and I think that drives him crazy. And so I think he will, as crazy as things have been, I think his rhetoric and perhaps his actions will get crazier and crazier as election day nears. This morning he was on that interview. He was urging Attorney General Barr and Secretary of State Pompeo, for some reason, and FBI Director Chris Wray to file criminal charges against President Obama and Vice President Biden, and of course Hillary Clinton, because her emails. And so he's going to continue pressing this point. He's going to. It's just going to be nuts. I don't see much that he can do that's going to change the numbers that Nate knows a whole lot better than any of the rest of us. But I am worried, like the Attorney General and Vanita and everybody else, about the actual process, the election process, which is being questioned in a way it never has before. I tend to be slightly Pollyanna-ish on this, in that I think most state election officials are pretty good at counting their votes. They know how to do it. They've had some time to think about how to do it in the middle of a pandemic. And most of them are serious about counting the votes and will stand by the integrity of their vote counts. Now, that's not universal, but I think that's the general rule, at least in my experience. So I think, we may well dodge all these bullets and get to the other side of this without some sort of major world historical disruption. But there does remain that possibility. I can't quantify it the way Nate can and say it's a 15% chance or a 5% chance, but it's a non-zero chance that this election goes completely off the rails. But I think it's a fairly small chance, and I think it looks as if we are prepared to elect a new president. But ask me again next week. Ask me again in a few hours.
Right.
What 10 crazy things have happened.
Right. But I mean, you've put your finger on something particularly troubling, which is that as we get closer and as the numbers look more favorable for Biden, you never know what President Trump is going to reach for or do, given, I mean, we've seen such extraordinary, eccentric moves recently, but it's hard to know like what's left in the arsenal. I mean, you get a sense there's a bit of a go back to the put her in jail kind of rhetoric that was useful, but it's hard to know exactly what extreme things might happen in the next couple of weeks.
Well, Bernard, it's like, and for a long time I've thought of this as You know, every day is a new episode in the Trump show, right? The reality show.
Which is what he said. Which was what he said before he actually was inaugurated, right? It's going to be a
right. Right. He wants, you know, that's what he said, and we should take his word for it. And that's the way he has run his administration. And so, you know, he will wake up tomorrow and he'll have some idea for scripting tomorrow's show. And it will probably be kind of crazy. And I think the crazy sort of mounts as we get closer to election day.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I, Bernard, just quickly add in here, which is, I think that there is, well, I could speak there. I have less of a concern. I mean, I totally agree. He is going to get more and more unhinged at this point. I don't have another word for it. The more freaked out he gets about his prospects for loss. I am not as focused on how low can he go, because we've been playing that game for 3.5 years, and that is less the concern. I think there's a lot of people who just believe that right now, at least given the numbers that Nate has been laying out and that we've all been reading, that the only way he wins is by doing the kinds of games and having people around him who play the kinds of games to change, you know, to have state legislatures determine the fate of the electors rather than the will of the people. That there are these rules that have never actually been tested in the way that the Constitution lays out. And there's a lot of constitutional scholars that have been going down rabbit holes about the various scenarios that could be played. But it requires, I want to say, and I think it's important to say this too, that the only way to kind of pull off a coup in this country, and I'm not saying that, you know, we know what the outcome it will be, but it does require a lot of different actors around the president to make that happen. It requires local election officials who retain custody of the ballots. It requires state election officials or secretaries of state. It would require governors. I think what is scary to people who are kind of concerned about our democratic process is that there has been for a long time an unwillingness to kind of by Republican officials, certainly in Congress, but in other places, to kind of stand up and put country over party. That's the kind of stuff that we have to prepare for, but it's, you know, it would be the most unprecedented thing that we could ever that we have conceived or seen in this country. And that's the type of thing that we have to be concerned about. But it's also concerns around the types of things around voter intimidation and dissuasion of voters. And so these are, I feel like this is the package of things that we're worried about. This is the place that we find ourselves in right now. Right now, between now and November 3rd, we need voters to show up and vote and to feel confident in our system. The way that authoritarians break down democracies is to make people believe that our system is so rigged, as I said. But I do think that there's this sense right now. And I worry too that if there is this feeling on both sides that our system may indeed be rigged, and that there's a concern around even just how polarized the country is right now in accepting the results of the election one way or the other. And so we have to be thinking about all of this. You look at the news today with Governor Whitmire and looking at the attacks and threats that are very real on state and local election officials, on governors, on law enforcement. This stuff is real and it's happening right now. And these are some of the heightened kind of concerns that a lot of us that do voting rights work have never seen before at this kind of pitch level. And that, as Nate said, he can't factor it into the polls, but we've got to be worried about it, and while retaining confidence.
Right. I mean, I think Vanita makes a good point there, and something is really important in what she said about people surrounding the president. I mean, I think, you know, these concerns about state legislatures doing things, state election officials, those are ultimate horrors. And as Vanita says, that requires a whole host of people and institutions to get on board with things that would be, you know, fundamentally undemocratic and potentially even, you know, criminal in nature. And so we have to prepare for that, but I'm not sure I get awfully worried about those things. And people, as Vanita says, should be going to the polls, should be voting, because in some ways that's the greatest antidote. But short of that, and trying to think about ways in which Trump might try to shake up the race, he has got around him people who will be complicit in those efforts, not the least of which is the Attorney General of the United States. You know, and I'd also put in that category the people who he has appointed in the intelligence community, who will, leak things, announce the investigations or the results of interim investigations. I mean, that doesn't happen in the Justice Department. People need to understand that these things about getting interim reports of ongoing investigations, that's just not normal. That's not what happens at the Justice Department. So, Barr, the guy who's the DNI now, I mean, there are a number of people who could try to help the president shake up the race. And though those things might not ultimately change the outcome, they could nevertheless be extremely damaging to the fabric of the nation.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about that what a lot of constitutional law scholars have been talking about in terms of state electors or going to the state electors in this kind of amendment process, 12th. In a second, Nate, I want to go back to you for a second because 2016. I mean, how do we evaluate the? You said, that the polls are more reliable than they were in 2016, or we thought. I mean, it was. Every day on the front of the New York Times in 2016, there was this needle that said it was, 85% that,
Don't blame the needle for that one. People understand risks perfectly well. When, like I said, for COVID, for example, people understand that a 15% chance of dying from COVID would be very serious. Our model had, Trump with a 30% chance, which is quite high. It's a baseball player getting a base hit. I think that the polls get quite unfairly blamed for 2016. The polls showed a close race. They showed Clinton ahead by only 3 or 4 points nationally, by only 2 or 3 points in some tipping point states. They were a little bigger lead in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but there weren't a lot of polls in that state. So no, I think a lot of kind of coastal elites thought that Trump couldn't possibly win, and then they kind of interpret all the evidence in that frame, right? Certainly, I think some of the big newspapers, institutions thought that Trump had a vanishingly small chance of winning when the polls actually showed it especially after the Comey letter, as a fairly close race. So the reason why you would have more confidence in the polls this year is not because the polls are any better, but because Joe Biden's lead is a lot larger. Joe Biden leads by 10 points and not 3, and 7 points in the tipping point states and not 2. So that's why the polls can be as wrong as they were in 2016 and Biden wins solidly. They can almost be twice as wrong and it would be close. And that can happen. There was 1948, Dewey defeats Truman. That was a bigger polling error than we saw in 2016, but those are rare historically. But we are kind of at like a funny point where I know Vanita kind of made the point that are we at the point yet where Trump can only win if something funny happens, right? I don't think we're at that point yet, right? Because our model says these are things that are not in the scope of it. And if you're having a normal election, Trump still wins that 15% of the time, which is, again, not 0. But I agree with the point everyone's been making, Vanita and Eugene, that I think Trump intuits that he's in deep trouble. Like the kind of video he posted this morning where he's like, seniors, I'm a senior too. He's fairly blatant pandering, right? And there are other signs too, like his campaign all of a sudden doesn't have very much money, which is really weird. And they're pulling ads from a lot of battleground states, and it almost seems like they're trying to save face a little bit. They're not advertising in Wisconsin and whatnot. I think Trump intuits that, and also some of the Republican leading firms have polls that show Trump behind, and also a lot of Republican senators are probably telling him, hey, look, I don't want to lose my seat. I care about you, but I really care about my seat. And I'm telling you, President, we have to turn the ship around here, right? But that could lead to a downward spiral where Trump is doing things that aren't terribly rational if he wants to win the election, but which are very dangerous for the democracy, right? And there are a lot of dark outcomes, even if Biden wins. People are concerned about the 25 days to the election. Well, what about the however many days it is between the inauguration and the election, right? What if Trump is concerned about, am I gonna go to jail, right? Would he try to pardon himself or try to resign and have then President Pence pardon him? I don't know, right? Even things like, okay, that period between November and January is likely to be pretty important in building public confidence for a coronavirus vaccine and in beginning to distribute it to people, right? If we lose 2 months of that because the president is kind of not in the right place, that's a polite way to put it, right? Or is trying to undermine or just doesn't care, that's 2 more months of people dying of COVID and not being able to get back to their normal lives, which is, I think, a pretty big consequence. And so, I think, there's also, frankly, there are risks to the president's health, right? If you look at the treatments he's on, those are fairly serious. I think journalists sometimes don't talk enough about the physical and mental conditions of the candidates. It's considered uncouth to do so, but if North Korea were to launch some missiles toward Japan right now, right, is the president of sound mind on the treatments he's on for coronavirus to respond to that? I don't know if that's clear, and so there are a lot of dark outcomes, most of which probably involve Biden winning, but still like a lot of bad places this could go.
Right. General Holder, you were a little bit sanguine, it seems to me, about the path that many people have discussed about kind of state electors taking over or something, and then there are 26 Republican states, and so all of a sudden there would be a Republican majority. But you seemed optimistic that it takes a lot of people for that to happen. But doesn't it actually just take a lot of litigation? In other words, kind of if following the November election, if the Trump campaign and surroundings file a lot of litigation, couldn't that be what would then push those states into kind of like a prolonged determination that would ultimately kick it over to the state electors?
Well, I mean, if they file litigation, courts have got to make determinations on the basis of evidence that is accumulated. And at base, you'd be talking about counting votes. And so they'd have to come up with some at least plausible way to argue that all the ballots, for instance, that were cast up to and including election day should be counted or something like that. And those that came through the mail were just rife with fraud and or illegitimate should not be counted. Courts would have to make that determination. They would run into, I think, as Vanita said, you have, I think good numbers of people at the state level who are really dedicated to doing kind of the job. Now there'll be some legislators who are on the Trump train and who want to do, crazy things. But I think to come up with this kind of essentially nationwide, not nationwide, you really needed, I guess, maybe, 5, 6, 7 states, whatever, but a multi-state conspiracy to make that effective. I don't say it's impossible, but it just seems to me that it's highly unlikely. And, the notion of just kind of filing lawsuits and to prolong it, and you get past, I guess, the Electoral College deadline, you somehow throw it into the House of Representatives.
Right.
Again, I can see how it's technically possible, but it just seems to me that at some point, reality has got to, poke its nose into our fears.
Vanita, in terms of kind of like what's being prepared for that period there, I understand well this idea that we need to maintain confidence in the election until November 3rd and make sure everybody votes. But in terms of what you are preparing for that period, what do you see as the focus of litigation, possibly, or
well, I think, there's going to be considerable litigation on ballot rejections, which ballots were rejected, why. Those are going to be between the parties. There's going to be much more of it when people try to compare this to Bush v. Gore. That was almost like it wasn't that it was without its own mess and chaos, but I think there's going to be a lot more litigation for the 5 weeks after November 3rd. But as General Holder said, at some point the states have to certify results to the electors, and that's a deadline in December. But there and litigation.
Hold on for a sec. Hold on. I think there's something scratchy with the audio, at least that I'm hearing. Or is other people not? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, go ahead. Vanita, go again.
Is it clearer now?
Well, it's got a little bit of a buzz to it.
Why don't I'm going to log off and log back in, and you can give somebody else a question.
Okay, great. Why don't we do that, and then we'll come right back to you. Eugene Robinson. So one of the things we were talking about was kind of like the unique nature of this situation right now. And I mean, one question I was asking myself, of course, is if because of a temporary condition, perhaps, if for instance, if Vice President Trump were the nominee at some point, is your sense that kind of most of the kind of extraordinary nature of all of this politics is associated singularly with President Donald Trump, and that in his, say, absence, that we would be returning to a normal or a more normalized politics in this country? Or is it that it has in some way infected all of politics and maybe the entire kind of political condition today in a way? Do you see the question I'm asking?
Yeah, I see the question. Well, I mean, it is, I think if the ground were not prepared for Donald Trump, we wouldn't have him. I mean, his emergence and his election, I think, were at least initially a symptom of something rather than the cause itself. These sort of divisions, economic, social, cultural, racial, these divisions that pre-existed Trump's emergence and that he was able to exploit. I mean, one thing he does extremely well is drive wedges, and he drove wedge after wedge after wedge, and forced people essentially to be with him or against him, and a lot of people were ready to be with him against the people on the other side. So we won't go through the whole list of the defining characteristics of those sides. It's not as simple as coastal versus flyover, elites versus non-elites. Education has something to do with it. Older, whiter America versus younger, more diverse America. He not only exploited the situation of division that was already there, but he broke norm after norm after norm. I mean, he has had just individually, he has had a huge role in sort of breaking the system by just throwing out the window all these sort of customs that both parties observed, and these norms that Republicans and Democrats sort of agreed on, even as they disagreed on everything else. They at least agreed basically on how you played the game of politics, and so that's out the window now. And so I mean, this program is too short to list all the norms he has broken. One of the most astonishing is the way he politically uses the Justice Department to further his own political ends, to conduct political investigations and perhaps prosecutions, to reward his friends and punish his enemies. That was not kosher. You couldn't do that, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican administration. You couldn't do that. Donald Trump does it, and does it without remorse. And so it's a combination. Yes, the ground was prepared for Donald Trump, but he He has individually, just as Donald Trump, he has just wiped out so many norms that I fear will be difficult to re-place and to get back.
Yeah. Before I go back to Vanita Gupta, Nate, is there anything in your models that would kind of confirm or tell us anything about that question? In other words, about, I don't know if it's questions of polarization or changes in the way that the electorate is thinking today, that is, in other words, that is greater than or larger than Donald Trump in a way?
Yeah, polarization has been increasing for a long time. It's maybe the most important political trend of the past 50 years is polarization, polarization, polarization. We have had it high at other moments in the country before. For example, the late 19th century, for example, early 20th century, you also had a lot of very close elections back then, very high degree of polarization. But that governs a lot of this, although I don't know. I mean, I do think that Trump himself is a powerful catalyst, and that if somehow Trump doesn't decide to settle some vendetta by running for the nomination, or he doesn't get 10 hours of CNN coverage a day and kind of dominate anyone else's airspace, and I think the country may be on a fairly different path. At the same time, I think some of the things that Vice President Pence were saying last night were dangerous. Or, I mean, Pence didn't really pledge to uphold the results of the election either. He was not very reassuring on that question. He was also not very reassuring about what happens if President Trump is not able to carry out his duties. He completely ducked that question, right? So those were not terribly reassuring answers. At the same time, I'm someone who believes in reversion to the mean, right? Kind of people tend to think that a trend goes on forever, but often it snaps back. I also am a believer that even though there are people that if Biden wins, there'll be people who think the election was stolen. The stench of being a one-term president and being a loser is pretty hard to stave off, right? Let's say the polls are approximately right and Trump loses by 8 points, right? And he loses Georgia, maybe he holds on to Texas barely, right? Loses Ohio and Iowa, loses Arizona. That's going to be seen as a historic, and Democrats take the Senate by a couple of seats. That's going to be seen as a pretty historic, epic failure for the GOP, right? Where they had the trifecta 4 years ago, and now they have usually lost control of the House, have lost the Senate despite a big bias in the Senate toward rural states, and then lose in a landslide margin in the presidency. And by the way, this year it's important also for redistricting. So that would mean there wouldn't be the same probably GOP gerrymandering advantage in all states as you had after 2010. That would be a heck of a price to pay. And Trump would be seen as kind of a model for maybe what not to do in certain ways.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I want to come back to the Senate, Nate, in a minute. But I wanted to go back to Vanita Gupta. Thanks for correcting the system a little bit.
Yeah, if it doesn't work, tell me
perfect.
If it isn't better. Okay.
Perfect, right.
Otherwise, I was going to dial in. Just quickly on your point, there will be litigation. People are preparing for that. The parties will litigate. Civil rights groups will litigate. There will be litigation really around which ballots have been rejected, why. There'll be a period of time during which the parties are going to do what they call chase and cure around, signature mismatching in states that allow for curing and the like. But at some point when it goes, this whole question about the electors and what happens there becomes a political question. It is unlikely actually that the court, I know there's been a lot of fear about even the court being in the hands of kind of in the grip of the president or of the Republican Party. But unlike Bush v. Gore, if this becomes a question about electors and state legislatures, it actually becomes a political question that Congress is going to get involved in, where the courts are unlikely to take that up. So the litigation is there, but I think there's a lot of other preparation that people are actually doing for this. And I spoke to some of it before, which is preparing the media to not prematurely call results and make people, what people have been calling a red mirage, but allowing candidates, including the president, to prematurely call results. It's also involved a lot of work that the Leadership Conference has been doing vis-a-vis Facebook and Twitter making sure disinformation around results, around threats, organizing of, terrorists and militias that may be trying to instigate and create fear and to turn the narrative for a premature calling of results doesn't happen. And so it's involved getting those companies to have, to understand the role that they play in combating disinformation on the platform and the viral spread that can really change these narratives. There's also, we saw massive protests over the summer around racial justice. There's a very active set of organizers working to get out the vote that I think are concerned and trying to make sure that if there is any perception about rigging of the elections, that folks are going to be ready nonviolently to show up to protect our democracy. So I think we think of this as like only in the realm of litigation and the courts, but actually in this moment, given the kind of polarization we're experiencing, the role of social media platforms in spreading disinformation or containing and combating it, all of these, kind of institutions and factors right now, a lot of us are working to kind of prepare for these worst case scenarios, even as we're working to try to instill or to try to get out the vote and make sure that voters turn out, that they know what the rules are. I mean, the other thing that's happening right now, Bernard, is there's a lot of rules changes. When the Supreme Court just this week changed voting in South Carolina and required a witness for absentee ballots, it on the ground creates a lot of confusion. And so being able to kind of retool, educate voters, some of these rules are going to change straight up to the election. And so we can't just be talking about November 3rd challenges. A lot of those challenges are happening right now, and they're going to impact whatever litigation we see after. But these are some of the kind of some of the preparatory work that's happening at this moment to try to protect and guard for a free and fair election.
Right. Yeah. No, thanks for that. There are so many issues to consider and to think about. I mean, and there's so many that I want to talk about, and before we even get to the questions from the audience, but the whole thing about the taxes, right? It's kind of, in some sense, Eugene, you were talking about the fact that there's so many things we've forgotten about. That was last week, right? I mean, the taxes and the redistricting is a big question I want to ask Eric about, and Russian interference. We haven't even talked about that, and the way in which social media are or are not doing a different job this time than they did last time, with some efforts being made to censor and to exclude what seemed to be kind of hacking. But there are just so many issues. It's hard to know which one to turn to. Eric, though, why don't you tell us a little bit about the importance of the election in terms of the redistricting? I mean, how is that going to affect all the work that you do with the NDRC?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to have a significant impact. We formed up the NDRC back in January of 2017, and so we've done a number of things that we already have in place, creating independent commissions, I guess, in 4 states. We've got governors in place in some critical states. We have a number of state legislators who have pledged to do the right thing when it comes to redistricting. But a substantial number of people who will be responsible for doing the redistricting in 2021 will be elected this year. Texas is one of our focus states. We need to win 9 seats in the Texas State House of Representatives so that Democrats will have a seat at the table when it comes to the redistricting that's done there. North Carolina is another place that we are focused on. We have other target states, but North Carolina and Texas are kind of, I think, among the largest targets that we have. So these elections are important not only for all the reasons we've talked about with regard to Trump, but also how we plot our democracy for the next 10 years at the state level will be in significant part determined by what happens in November. And people need to understand, that who you elect or who is in your state legislature probably has a greater impact on your day-to-day life than who the president of the United States is. We're all concerned about criminal justice reform. That'll be decided by the states. A woman's right to choose, reproductive rights, decided by the states. Healthcare, significant federal involvement there, obviously, but expansion of Medicaid in certain states like Texas, that'll be decided at the state level. There's a whole range of things that, the protection of voting rights, these unnecessary photo ID laws, closing of polling places, purging, all decided at the state level. And so that's why, one more reason why these elections, again, are so, so very, very, very important. We have, as I said, I'm pretty confident that the Democrats are in a fundamentally different place than we were in 2010. We didn't focus on it to the extent, in 2011, we didn't focus on it to the extent that we should have. We didn't have the technological capabilities that we had. We didn't have the focus on the redistricting process, that we now have. So I think we're in pretty good shape, but we've got to do well in November.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can I throw one thing in there, which is just General Holder's endeavor to have fair maps and fight unlawful gerrymandering is also dependent on another thing that's happening in 2020, which is the US Census count, which has also been messed with pretty significantly by the Trump administration. And the leader, and it's, it would be remiss of me not to mention it as another kind of democratic institution that is core written into the Constitution. And there have been all kinds of efforts between the citizenship question and now the effort to curtail the count and try to have apportionment data exclude undocumented immigrants to change the denominator of who counts in this country and how districts are drawn. So there's that can be your own, maybe you've already had a different session on it, but that is all happening in real time with consequences for the next 10 years, with consequences for shaping the electorate in the United States, for the consequences of enforcing civil rights laws, consequences on the distribution of, over $1 trillion of federal funding, particularly important right now during COVID. So just it'll be the basis of redistricting at the state level as well for the next 10 years. So how power gets allocated, how resources get allocated. But there is a direct connection, I think, between the effort to kind of rig our democracy against voting access and against who counts in this country in the face of very changing demographics. And it's all happening in real time right now. And that's why we're working, to help protect the census, to get at the count, which has been really challenged by COVID, but also by a very intentional effort to weaponize it for a partisan gain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. Nate, very quickly on the Senate, what are your models showing, and how much fluctuation is there in the weeks to come?
You have the race kind of break from a toss-up in the Senate to Democrats being favored, not as heavily favored as the presidency, but being roughly 2-to-1 favorite, 67%. The Senate's weird in that there are an enormous number of competitive races, maybe 12 seats that could flip from R to D, and also a couple that could flip from D to R, like Doug Jones in Alabama. So there's not like any one set of races that Democrats would feel completely confident in. They probably start with Arizona and Colorado, so that's 2. But then you can kind of question any other race, right? Susan Collins is an underdog, but some polls have shown the race tighter. She's a long-time incumbent there. In North Carolina, the Democrats ahead in polls, but it's had a sexting scandal. So there are a lot, Georgia is competitive, but it's more like you have a menu of options to pick from. And you need somewhere for Democrats between 3 and 5, depending on does Doug Jones lose and do they win the presidency. And kind of statistically, it'll probably work out more often than not, but there's a big range for the GOP holding the Senate to Democrats getting as many as 54, 55 seats. I think these things are important. Right? I think a 52-seat Democratic majority would literally get twice as much done as a 50-seat majority, and a 54-seat majority would get twice as much done as a 52-seat majority. Because if Democrats are looking to make big structural changes with respect to adding states or the Supreme Court or the filibuster, Joe Manchin's not going to go along with that stuff, I don't think, right? If Doug Jones is still in the Senate, he might actually, but maybe not, right? Dianne Feinstein might not. You'll have some old kind of fuddy-duddies, no offense, who I think might be traditionalist, right? But you get to 54 and you have a landslide, and Democrats, I think, will say, hey, look, we've got our 2 years. We have all these problems to solve that have been caused by 4 years of Trump, and we're going to be very aggressive about it, even though it might not be in Joe Biden's nature, who's an incrementalist, I think, right? I think the historic nature of the moment would not be lost on Democrats if they have that big majority.
All right, let me introduce some of the questions from the audience. The first one is from Professor Robert Shapiro, who's the Wallace Sayre Professor of Government and International Public Affairs here at Columbia University, and he has a question to you, Nate Silver. The question is to what extent have the state pollsters been taking care to weight or estimate an electorate that they think approximates the correct number of white voters without college degrees, perhaps especially in rural and small town areas? So that's the two kind of technical questions for your models. So have the state pollsters been taking care to weight or estimate correct numbers of white voters without college degrees? And then the second is, are the Republicans planning to send a large number of poll watchers to monitor and challenge voters and votes? And if so, will the Democrats do the same to project voters, maybe to protect voters? I mean, maybe that one goes to Eric Holder.
Yeah, Vanita would be good on that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate, though. Start with the first one.
So on the polling question, the most important thing to know empirically is, well, two things, right? Number one, you can have what we call systematic polling errors, which means almost all the polls are off in the same direction in almost all the swing states, right? But number two, it's very, very hard to predict in which direction those errors occur, in part because pollsters do try to compensate for the last time, right? And most pollsters are now weighting by education. What this means is that if you just randomly call people on the phone, that people who are college educated are more likely to respond to a pollster's phone call. They're also more likely to vote Democratic, right? So you have to weight your electorate in several ways. You also, by the way, have trouble getting Hispanic and Black voters on the phone sometimes. You have to wait for race too. Historically, sometimes when you think the polls are going to be biased in one direction, then they're biased the other way instead, right? Maybe pollsters are not getting enough Hispanics on the phone, for example. You see polls showing Trump doing better with Hispanics, but polls have underestimated how well Democrats would do in states like Arizona and California in recent elections, for example. So, look, if Biden's ahead by 9 points on election and the polling average on election night, I mean, 9 points is probably pretty safe, right? But in theory, there'd be the same chance that Trump wins and that Biden wins by 18, right? It would be symmetrical. And in fact, you might think pollsters have a lot of incentives to not underestimate Trump because people hate making the same mistake twice, right? Maybe that means they would not be as careful about thinking about ways that Biden could be underestimated. But we'll see. Again, to me, these questions are not that interesting if you have a 9 point or a 10 point margin in the polls. If we go back to 4 or 5, then yes, it's time to be very concerned about them again.
Good. And then on the second question, which has to do with the poll watchers to monitor and challenge votes and stuff, do you have something in your models regarding that, predictions about and whether the Democrats are going to be protecting voters and stuff, or not?
No, we look at whether a state has made it easier to vote or harder to vote based on something called the cost of voting index, which is put together by some political scientists. So that is factored in the baseline probabilities in each state. And that does matter, actually, right? You can see a state shifting by 2 or 3 points in the direction if there's a big easing or restrictions on the right to vote. With that said, that's kind of in the normal scope of things, right? The parties are always fighting this battle to make it harder or easier to vote. And again, our analysis shows that they fight those fights for good reasons, right? Because it really does make a big difference how easy it is to vote, and it can swing close elections.
Cool, good. Eric, anything on this kind of protecting voters and this whole question of the poll watchers? I mean,
yeah, I was actually serious about deferring to Vanita here. I mean, she is doing stuff on the ground and working with the organizations. She has that umbrella organization working with other groups. So maybe Vanita, you could share what's being planned in that regard.
Yeah, there's a pretty massive effort that the civil rights community is running out of, it's called election protection, and groups all over the country of recruiting observers or poll watchers. There's been a concern because the RNC, for the first time, they were under a consent decree around poll watchers based on voter intimidation that poll watchers had engaged in infamously in New Jersey a few decades ago. This is the first election since that consent decree was actually lifted, and the president has numerous times been talking about how they're going to have tens of thousands of people in the polls. And so, but there are different efforts afoot. The campaigns will have observers, and there's a big NGO effort to have observers in the polls as well. But there's a role in for state attorneys general, obviously for law enforcement and protecting voter safety. It is against the law, against federal law to intimidate voters, to block access to the polls. There's going to be a balancing around First Amendment expression and voter intimidation that clearly violates the law. So there's a lot of trainings happening with law enforcement, mayors, state attorneys generals right now to try to protect voter safety. But there is a significant network of poll watchers around the country, both on the official side and the NGO side.
Okay, thanks. I've got a couple of questions that seem the kind of questions that I kind of feel one would be asking more in kind of Pinochet's Chile or other contexts. But here we are in the United States. Some of them have to do with kind of, one is like, if President Trump does claim victory before all the votes are counted and refuses a peaceful transfer of power, what next? And another question having to do with the Supreme Court. Can Trump reject a Supreme Court verdict against him? Or what would happen in that case? These are kind of questions that I would have anticipated in another country at another period of time under maybe a dictatorship or something. But here we are. Eric Holder, can you tell us how to think about those questions?
Well, power shifts on January the 20th of 2000, and let's assume that Joe Biden has been elected. We've gone through all that. If Trump wants to maintain power, I mean, he is going to have to, he can rant and rave about the fact that he is still a legitimate president. He wants to hold on to power. The nuclear codes, the guy with the football, the suitcase that has all the nuclear codes will move towards Biden. The military, they will, salute and be with Biden. Now, and so I don't think he'll be able to unilaterally hold on to power. Now, that doesn't mean, however, that on that day and the day, I think maybe as Nate was saying, from election day until inauguration day, that he can't do great damage and stir up a great deal of unrest, violence, perhaps even in the United States. You would expect any normal politician defeated at that point to urge unity, healing of the nation. I'm not sure that's how this guy is wound. And that being the case, I worry about that period. I really do. He will be a president, a person with full presidential powers for, those couple of months. People disgruntled, his core disgruntled by his defeat, not being called off by their leader. That worries me a great deal. But I do think that on January the 20th at noon, and assuming Biden has won the election, Donald Trump will, if he has to be carried out of the White House, he will no longer be the president of the United States. But I think the thing that gives me greater heartburn is that period from November the 3rd to January the 20th.
Bernard, if I could throw in one quick thing. I covered Pinochet's Chile.
Right.
I covered the plebiscite in 1988 when Pinochet he called a plebiscite to be granted 12 more years in power, and was defeated in that plebiscite and had to leave after 2 years. And I remember the night of the vote, when it was fairly clear that no on 12 more years for Pinochet, that no was winning. It released returns, and then all of a sudden the government stopped releasing the results. and no one knew what was going to happen. No one knew if Pinochet was going to accept it. And finally, it was around midnight or so, another member of the junta, I believe it was the head of the Air Force, came out and said, you know, the government has lost, and therefore, you know, we will surrender power in 2 years, and, you know, congratulated the other side. And not a word from Pinochet, but it was somebody else in his government who came out and made that announcement. And then the returns came out, and he did indeed end up leaving at the appointed hour. I'm hoping that election night this year doesn't have quite that kind of suspense.
Yeah, me neither, or the days thereafter. I've got a question for you, another question for you, Eugene, though, and this one's coming from Peter Trevino, who's General Studies 2022. And it's an interesting question. He writes, of those norms that have been obliterated by Trump and his administration, which are the most likely to have the longest tail in terms of reversal and return to normalcy, even during a Biden administration? So what are the broken norms that are likely to have the longest lives as broken norms, really?
That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't know exactly how you rank them. I mean, some of them you can turn around just by not being Donald Trump, right? And Joe Biden wins. By being Joe Biden, he's going to be different. I think the ways in which he has kind of broken various parts of the government are not going to be trivial to fix. The way he has sort of broken institutions of the government, broken the State Department. He's tried to break the Justice Department. All that's going to have to be repaired, and it's not going to be immediate. It's not going to be easy. In terms of the way the parties relate to each other and the way we conduct politics, I think maybe it takes a while, but I think we can, I don't think it'll be Trumpian after Trump. I think once Trump is a loser, I think he's then a loser. I think his, the idea that he, for a long period of time, remains the center of attention, though he might want to be, I think that does fade.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Eric, what do you think about that? I mean, treaties can be renegotiated. Tax returns can be required. I suppose there could be a bill, but what do you think there is that's been broken that is going to have the longest impact or the greatest effect?
Yeah, the concern I have is not necessarily institutional. I mean, I think the Justice Department can repair itself. The intelligence community can repair itself. You can reconfigure or rebuild, the State Department. It won't be instantaneous, but it can be done. My concern is more with what he's unleashed in our people and made it acceptable, for a guy today to describe Kamala Harris, I think, as an insufferable lying bitch, for somebody to think that you can say something like that's okay, or for a group of people to think that you can conspire to kidnap the governor of Michigan and hold her hostage or do something to her.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure that's norm breaking, but those kinds of allowing that kind of stuff to rise in the country, that's going to be, I think, difficult. Trump may be gone, but I think Trumpism or Trumpian kinds of things, Trumpian ways of thinking, that's going to be kind of hard to put back. I mean, a lot of this stuff is like a virus within, the body of this nation. And we've never actually come up with a vaccine. We have therapeutics that kind of keep it down for, hopefully prolonged periods of time, and it surfaces every once in a while. And if we don't have the leadership there, to administer those therapeutics, it can it can really, it can take hold in ways and for extended periods of time. And, you know, instead of having a leader here who's, again, administering the therapeutics, he's actually, you know, fostering these kinds of things. And so that, I think, over the long term is what is what worries me.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll
Vanita,
just add.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
I'll just add, I'm with General Holder on this. I also would add the emboldening of white supremacy as such an overt kind of movement in this country. It's not to say that any of us have been ignoring it for, you know, it's been with us since the nation's history. It's embedded in our nation's history. But I think it's disturbing for a lot of us to see the degree to which that theory movement has been so incredibly emboldened and put into the mainstream. And I think we're going to have to really confront that as a country. You know, and the way it has been normalized, the way, not so it's rhetorically, but also in policy. And that is, you know, that's with us, whether Trump is here or not, as president. And I think that these are some of the things that I think are really going to be difficult when people talk about unifying the country and bringing people together. You know, it's hope. I'm a civil rights advocate. I am eternally hopeful. It's why I can do this work day in and day out. But I got to tell you, it is pretty scary to see how the degree to which white supremacy is so now kind of overt, accepted, out in the open. And we're going to really have to confront that and contend with that in a serious way. So yes, norms and rules and withdrawal of policies and reinstating and that type of thing. But I think that's one. The other thing is just confronting the fact that we have a democratic system right now, where it does feel like a minority of the country pushing against the will of the majority is able to control our democracy. And those are issues that some of which Nate talked about. It's, you know, problems with even like the structure of the Senate, the Electoral College, you know, concerns around, and it's why a lot of us are gearing towards HR 1 as something that needs to happen in a new Congress or at some point when it's politically palatable to actually have our democracy be able to work for all of us. And the Supreme Court power grab that we're witnessing right now, and who is on the Supreme Court and whether the Supreme Court will retain any legitimacy given, you know, does it represent actually the American people at all? I think all of these things are things that we will have to confront and contend with.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's so crazy. I mean, there are so many issues. We haven't even had a chance to talk about the nomination of a Supreme Court justice in 30 days, right? In a 30-day process. Okay, there are a lot more questions coming in. They're all excellent. We've been able to address a few. What I'd like to do is this, and we're running out of time. There's one for Nate that I want to get to, and then I want to ask. I want to maybe ask the three of you the final question, and then maybe we can wrap up. Nate, there's a question from Stephen Winnick, who's Columbia College, and he's asking, based on current public opinion polls, what do you think is the biggest tactical blunder each campaign is currently making? It's kind of an interesting question.
I think Joe Biden's run a very good campaign. If you're 9 or 10 points ahead, then there's not a lot one would complain about. I think they may have made a mistake by not doing door knocking. There are a lot of states where Republican registration has outpaced Democratic registration. Part of that's because Democrats had a more competitive primary, so you had people registering earlier in the year. But I think the lack until recently of an in-person campaign may not have been smart by Biden. With Trump, I mean, the basic error of Trump's understanding of politics that he thinks that just playing to his base is the way to win, right? And the problem is that's one of three things that you worry about, right? There's how much does your base turn out? How much does the other side's base turn out? And what do independent voters do, or swing voters? Trump does really well by that one metric, right? You had very high turnout in the midterms, for example, from his base, but they lost the popular vote for the House by 9 points because independents voted very strongly with Democrats, and Democrats also had huge turnout for a midterm. And I think Trump just doesn't get that, in part because it feels good to do the things that appeal to his base, right? You know, he's not playing a racist for show, right? That's kind of part of who he is and how he thinks. And so you can always kind of tell yourself, oh, I'm just going to do what the base likes, right? And that's how I won, which I think is not how we won in 2016. In 2016, he did fairly well with independents. A lot of late deciders broke toward Trump. A lot of people, by the way, in 2016 who didn't like either Clinton or Trump said, what the hell, let's vote for Trump, right? This year, those people are mostly voting for Biden. So, you know, that's kind of at the core of all of what he's done. I think Trump is a overrated. People complain about all the breaking of norms with good reason, right? Because they're like, oh, but he's a clever politician. I don't think he's a clever politician either.
Okay. Eugene, you're shaking your head. Yes.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely agreeing with Nate. I think you know, this idea that Trump is a master political genius who plays three-dimensional chess that we mere mortals can't understand is completely wrong. And he absolutely plays only to his base, and his base isn't big enough. That's his problem. You see it in Nate's numbers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks. All right, so I'm being told we're at 7:30, but I've got one last question. Maybe I'll toss it to Eric Holder and Vanita Gupta, and it is from Ruby Adun, who is in C's class of 21, so our engineering college. And he says, "What should I say to my friends when they say my vote really doesn't matter?" Eric Holder.
Well, don't smack them, because that's among the dumbest things I think anybody could say. Here's the deal. If your vote didn't matter, you have to ask yourself, why is the other side going to these extraordinary measures to make it difficult for you to exercise that right to vote? So in the present, you just, you know, empirically, you can see how important the other side perceives your vote to be. But more, you know, I don't know, philosophically or more holistically, you know, people sacrificed, committed their lives, gave their lives so that you might have the right to vote. You know, John Lewis, you know, my dear friend and an idol of mine, got his skull cracked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge so that people would have the right to vote. Civil rights workers, 1963, gave their lives so that people would have the right to vote. And, you know, we can go on with that. And so there's a debt that I think we owe to those prior generations. There is a duty I think we have now to shape the present in which we live. And it is through voting that we ultimately determine what the future of this nation is going to look like. So yeah, you know, your vote matters. The other side gets it, that your vote matters. History demands that you understand that your vote matters. And so, you know, whether the weather is bad, whether you were at a party the night before, whatever it is, no excuse. It really justifies you not participating in the process. I think that's the one thing that we as citizens, that's the one duty that we all have as citizens. And there, as I said, there's this historical obligation, and I would hope that you somehow convey that in a better way, perhaps, than I have to you know, any friend of yours who would ask that question.
Vanita Gupta, last word to you.
No, I think that we should let Attorney General Holder have that last word. I would only repeat it, but he said it.
All right, excellent. All right, great. There are a lot of other excellent questions that have been posted. Some of them had to do with, for instance, the Electoral College. We actually had a panel on the Electoral College with Eric Holder last year or the year before. And those are recorded, and it was a really terrific panel talking also about the 270 project. So I'm going to refer you to our other panels, but also I'll invite you back and we can continue this discussion on November 5th, 2 days after the election, November 5th, 2020. We will be here.
But Bernard, that assumes we've not all been rounded up and placed in.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, assuming we can be here, Eric Holder will be here and we'll have a panel. So I want to thank an extraordinary panel this evening, Eugene Robinson, Nate Silver, Eric Holder, Vanita Gupta. Thank you so much for your participation and your insights. We all learned so much. I want to give a special shout out to Beth Manchester, the Associate Director of the Eric Holder Initiative, for creating all of this, and Chris Ballmer for helping make this all possible. So thank you all. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, guests, for attending and watching. And stay tuned. November 5th, same time, same channel. We look forward to seeing you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Take care.